Hello, everyone. In this video, I'm going to go through the production of the first graph you need to make for the acceleration due to gravity lab, okay, and the process to do it on Excel. So what we want to graph in our first graph is simply the height of the ball versus the average time. Okay, notice at this point, we've taken our averages, right? We've taken the average times. And what we're not going to do is plot this data anymore. Have already taken averages, and this is now our data, okay, together with the uncertainty that we have calculated, okay? Just one note before we go on, because I didn't mention this in the last video, but take a look at the values of this uncertainty here as calculated. You'll notice it's in the same ballpark as these data points right here, but it's not identical, okay? So this is a better calculation of the uncertainty for these particular data points. That's part of why we take multiple trials. Not only that, but we reduce the effect of the random error on our average time. So we're going to plot the height versus the average time. And there are a number of different ways to do this. So I'm going to just start with one of them. What I'm going to do is select all of my data. And I'm going to do that by sort of clicking down here. And that's pretty easy. But then I'm going to Command or Control click to highlight that data point as well. And then I'm going to Shift click down. So I hold the Shift button and then click again. And that will highlight both of the columns of data that I want. Notice I'm only highlighting the data and not the column label. I'm then going to insert a chart. And the chart I would like to insert is this chart right here, which is just a pure XY scatter. Notice I'm not connecting the dots. I just want a scatter plot. And that's my data, okay? So this is the pure XY scatter data. Now, let's say I messed up and I'm not using the right data, and I want to go in and change what data I'm using. Well, to do that, I need to get very familiar with a button known as Select Data. Select Data will open up this sheet right here, and it will allow me to select whatever data I want. So let's say I messed up with my data, and I have the wrong column in here. Well, I can re-enter both my X values and my Y values by saying, okay, here are my X values. I'm going to click on this X value button, and then I can drag in the values I would like to graph. So I'm going to drag in the X values and the Y values one more time. Notice they're already entered properly, so nothing will change about my graph. And then that's okay, all right? And I'm going to name this data series if I'd like. I can name that here or add different data if I'd like. So if I want to plot different data on the plot, I can add another series, and that would include other data on the same plot. Click OK. Now, for this chart, right, this is my pure data, I need to change a bunch of things about the chart to have it formatted correctly, okay? The first thing I'm going to do is give it an appropriate title, and an appropriate title you can sometimes decide you want something else, but almost always what's appropriate is the just saying the dependent variable, in this case the average time, versus the independent variable, in this case the height. Okay. I'm also going to add some labels. Okay, so I need some labels, and I would like to label my axes. So we're going to do axes titles, I guess is what this version of Excel is calling them. I'm going to throw some in, both primary horizontal and primary vertical, and I'm going to label them with unit. So this is height in units of meters, and this is time in units of seconds, which is great. All right, now that I have this data on my chart, I want to make sure that I can see that data pretty well. Okay, so I could mess with the formatting in other ways, but I'm going to double click my data points here, and I want to make sure I get all of them. So I'm going to double click my data points here, and then I'm going to adjust the marker, and I want the marker to be different in a couple of ways. I want it to be a different type, okay, a different type in that I want it to be a large X. And by using a large X, we can make sure that we see our error bars later on. So I'm going to crank up the size, but I made it an X, okay? And that gives me these data points right here. I could even make it a little bolder if I wanted, but this is good enough for now. And then with these data points, I want to make sure that I can have sort of enough grid lines to see what my data might be. So I'm going to add some grid lines here, okay? And I'm just going to choose some of the defaults. I want some primary, minor, and primary, minor, vertical grid lines. This gives me just a little more ability to read where that value is on the chart if I need to, okay? You can make those sort of less transparent or more if you really desire. And then finally, for my graph here, my raw data graph, I'm gonna want to show the appropriate trend line. So I'm gonna add a trend line. And you're always going to need to think about what that trend line should be. In this case, I don't want actually any of these options. But in order to add that trend line, what I'm going to do is just add a straight linear trend line. And then I'm going to go in and edit it. So I'm going to format this trend line. The first thing I want to do is make sure that trend line is the function that I want it to be. And you'll see there are a number of other options than were available just from the drop-down menu. In particular, the function corresponding for our experiment to this experiment is a power law, okay? And we expect actually this data to fit a power law of order 1/2. That is, we expect the exponent to be 1/2. So I'm gonna switch to a power law and I'm gonna display the equation on the chart, okay? And that gives me the equation right here. And you'll notice with the equation, I could make it bigger, I can edit it now, but that is now the equation of this line. I'm also going to make that line just a little more visible, okay? Because right now, it's not particularly visible. So I'm gonna just crank up. I want it to be a solid line. And maybe if I crank up the width, it's still a dotted line, which is kind of interesting. Sorry, and I just want it to be a solid line here. That's actually a little too big, okay, but I can see my trend line pretty clearly on the graph. I could change the color as well if desired. The last thing I'm going to do here is replace my variables in my equation with the appropriate variables. So my y variable here, and I can also make this a little bigger. So hold on, let's make it bigger first. I'm sorry, I'm just looking for the font size of this particular text. Maybe I'll do it just by using this. I don't know. Could be possible. I'm gonna crank this up a little bit. Will that work? Yes, it will. All right. So increase the font a little bit so I can see the equation more clearly on the chart. My y-axis variable is actually, in this case, the time. Okay, so I'm gonna replace y with t, and my x-axis variable is, in this case, the height. So I'm going to replace my x variable with h here. And you can see that I now have an equation on my chart that shows the fill white. Okay, that shows the equation of my best fit line, right? And in this case, my best fit power law. So at this point, I have an appropriately labeled graph with my data points, my best fit trend line, and my trend line equation shown. The final thing I need to add to my raw data graph are my error bars, okay? To add the error bars, what I'm gonna do is click on my data points here, and perhaps the chart, actually, would be the best way to start. And I'm gonna add a chart element, and I'm just gonna pick the standard error at first, okay? So it's gonna just throw some error bars on my graph. Right? And those aren't the error bars I want, but now there are error bars on my graph that I can then edit. The first set I'm going to edit are these horizontal error bars. The horizontal error bars are the error bars on the height variable, which means I want them to be this particular value, 0.02 meters, because that is my error on the height. So what I'm going to do is go into here, and I'm going to choose a fixed value, and I want that to be 0.02. Okay, because that is my error on the height. And you'll see that adjusts my error bars. And if I zoom in here, you can see they still exist, but they're pretty small. And you can also see why our data point is shown with this X. Okay, so the X makes it clearer where the actual center of that point is, and you can see that error bar clearly. But for my vertical error bars, right, my vertical error bars, I actually want my vertical error bars to reflect these different values. So I don't want them all to have the same value, and I don't want the computer to calculate the values. I want the computer to graph plus this uncertainty and minus this uncertainty. So what I'm going to do for that is use this option called custom. Okay. And for the custom data here, I'm going to click custom and then I'm going to specify my value. It's going to give me this particular screen. And so I'm going to say my positive error, okay, my positive error should be these values here, drag them in. And my negative error should be these values here, drag them in again. And then I click OK. And if I've done that, now I have custom error bars in both the vertical and horizontal direction. And at this point, I could make some of the labels bigger if I wanted, make it a little easier to read. But at this point, I have everything I need for my raw data graph.